August 24th, 1942, 0330 hours, the Don River steppe. In the pre-dawn chill, a silence settled over the vast, featureless plains west of the Don. It was a silence alien to the Eastern Front, a deceptive calm in the heart of the largest and most brutal conflict in human history. Here, the German Sixth Army's push towards Stalingrad had stretched the Axis lines thin, leaving the flanks to be screened by Allied formations. On this sector, that responsibility fell to the Italian Eighth Army. The men of the Soviet 304th Rifle Division, dug into the earth on the west bank of the river, understood this. They had spent the night consolidating their positions, their foxholes and machine gun nests, forming an interlocking web of fire across a 2-kilometer front. They were veterans of a different kind of war, a war of massed artillery and grinding attrition. Their commanders had reviewed the intelligence reports. The flank was held by Italians, more specifically by cavalry. The very notion was almost laughable. In a war defined by the Panzer and the T-34, by the Stuka and the Ilyushin II, the idea of facing men on horseback seemed like a dispatch from a forgotten century. It was a tactical absurdity, a sign of weakness, an enemy clinging to traditions that had been rendered obsolete by the machine gun 50 years prior. This profound underestimation, born from a correct assessment of technology but a complete failure to understand the nature of their opponent, was the first in a chain of catastrophic miscalculations. The Soviet force was formidable, a hardened infantry regiment of nearly 3,000 men. They were supported by more than 80 machine gun nests, dozens of mortar teams, and dedicated anti-tank positions, even though they expected no tanks. Their trenches were well sited along the low rises of the steppe, commanding perfect fields of fire over the flat, open ground. They were patient, disciplined, and utterly confident. Their mission was to hold this bridgehead, to draw Axis reserves, and to prepare for a future breakout. Facing them in the darkness was an anachronism made real: the Italian 3rd Savoia Cavalry Regiment. The Savoia was not a mere transport unit that used horses. It was a true cavalry regiment, steeped in 3 centuries of tradition. Its 600 troopers were horsemen from birth, elite soldiers who measured their effectiveness not in engine horsepower, but in bloodlines and sabers. Their commander, Colonel Alessandro Bettoni Cazzago, was a master equestrian, a veteran of a dozen international show-jumping competitions. His world was one of precision, timing, and the unbreakable bond between man and horse. The equipment of his regiment was a strange blend of the modern and the archaic. Each trooper carried a Model 91 Carcano carbine and a sheathed Model 1871 cavalry saber, a heavy, single-edged blade designed for a full gallop slash. They carried Breda-like machine guns and had learned to prime and throw hand, grenades from a moving horse. The regiment's horses were not simple beasts of burden. They were a mixture of Italian-bred mounts and hardier Russian stock, conditioned to the harsh steppe environment. They were trained to respond to bugle calls, to ignore the crack of rifle fire and the crump of mortars, to gallop in tight formation through chaos that would scatter lesser animals. To the Soviet commanders, these were just animals, targets. To the men of the Savoia, they were partners in war, the engines of their mobile firepower. The ideological chasm between the two forces was as wide as the Don River itself. The Soviets were fighting a materialist war, a war of numbers, production, and overwhelming firepower. They believed in the immutable mathematics of modern combat, where tonnage of steel and weight of fire determined the victor. The Italians of the Savoia, while equipped for the 20th century, still held to an older warrior's creed, one that valued audacity, shock, and the belief that a perfectly executed moment of violence could shatter the logic of numbers. That clash of philosophies was about to be tested on the plains of Izbushensky. The discovery came shortly after midnight. A forward patrol of the Savoia, moving silently through the tall grass and scattered sunflower fields, nearly stumbled into the Soviet perimeter. The patrol's leader, a young lieutenant, brought back a chilling report to Colonel Bettoni. This was no small reconnaissance party. It was a deeply entrenched, heavily armed regimental force, far too large for his cavalry to handle alone. The tactical situation was dire. The Soviet bridgehead was a dagger aimed at the thinly held Italian line. If it was not contained, it could be reinforced and break wide open, threatening the flank of the entire 8th Army and, beyond it, the German drive on Stalingrad. The textbook solution was clear. Fix the enemy in place, call for artillery support, and wait for infantry and armor to be brought up for a coordinated assault. This would take days. The nearest armored support was more than 70 kilometers away, already engaged with other threats. The divisional artillery was spread thin, prioritizing the defense of other sectors. Waiting was the sensible option, the modern military solution. It was also the surest way to allow the Soviet force to grow stronger, to dig in deeper, and to become an immovable object. Colonel Bettoni stood before a map spread on the hood of a vehicle, lit by a single hooded lantern. He listened to the reports. 3,000 rifles, 80 machine guns, dozens of mortars, all dug in, all waiting. To his staff, the problem was one of mechanics and numbers. An attack would be suicidal. But Bettoni saw the problem through the eyes of a cavalryman. He saw not a fortress of earth and steel, but a psychological position. The enemy was confident, dug in, and expecting a conventional, predictable fight. Their strength, their static, prepared defense, was also their greatest weakness. They were mentally anchored to the ground, their tactics based on the assumption that the fight would come to their trenches, on their terms. The colonel made a decision that defied every tenet of modern warfare. He would not wait. He would not call for support. He knew would not arrive in time. He would attack. He would use the one weapon in his arsenal that the Soviets could not comprehend and were wholly unprepared for: a full-scale 19th century cavalry charge. He would not attack their guns. He would attack their minds. The plan was a masterpiece of cavalry doctrine adapted for a modern battlefield. It was a symphony of movement and violence, timed to the minute. The regiment's 2nd Squadron, about 150 men, would be the centerpiece. They would charge the Soviet front directly at dawn, using the rising sun to blind the defenders. At the same time, the 4th Squadron's machine gun section would dismount and lay down a base of suppressive fire on the Soviet left flank, distracting them and forcing them to divide their attention. While the 2nd Squadron was engaged, the 4th Squadron, still mounted, would execute a wide flanking maneuver and smash into the side of the Soviet position. The 1st Squadron would be held in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough or cover a retreat. It was a plan of immense risk. It required perfect timing, incredible discipline, and a level of courage that bordered on the insane. If the machine gunners failed to suppress the enemy, the charge would be shredded before it covered half the distance. If the horses faltered or the troopers lost their nerve, they would be slaughtered in the open. The orders were passed in hushed tones through the ranks. There was no grand speech. There was no need. These men had trained for this moment their entire lives. They began their preparations in the darkness. Ammunition was distributed. The heavy leather saddles were checked and cinched tight. Grenades were hung from pommels, ready to be snatched and thrown. The most important ritual was the sharpening of the sabers. Troopers drew the long, curved blades, the steel whispering from the scabbards, and ran whetstones along the edges. This was not for show. They knew what was coming. This would not be a battle of long-range fire. It would be a collision, a maelstrom of close-quarter combat where the edge of a blade would be the final arbiter. As the eastern sky began to pale from black to a bruised purple, the squadrons moved into position. The dismounted machine gunners of the 4th Squadron crept forward, their breeder machine guns and Schwarzlow's heavy machine guns carried in pieces and assembled silently in the tall grass. The mounted squadrons formed up in long lines, the troopers holding their nervous horses in check. The only sounds were the jingle of harnesses, the soft snorting of the animals, and the thump of 1,000 human hearts. In the Soviet trenches, the first light of dawn brought with it the routine of a new day at war. Sentries peered into the morning mist that clung to the steppe. The Italians were out there, they knew. They expected probing attacks, perhaps a light infantry assault to test their lines. They checked their machine gun belts and stacked mortar rounds nearby. They were ready for a fight, but they were ready for a 20th century fight. They were entirely unprepared for what was about to emerge from the mist. At precisely 05:30, a single bugle call cut through the air. It was the signal. It was not a hesitant note. It was a clear, piercing command that spoke of centuries of cavalry tradition. It was the call to the charge. From the perspective of the Soviet trenches, the first sign was a low rumble, a vibration in the very earth beneath them. Then, figures began to emerge from the dissipating mist. Not of men running in a crouch, but of something taller, larger. A long, dark line of horsemen, moving at a slow trot, sabers still sheathed, their lances, for the lead elements still carried them, held upright. It was so unexpected, so bizarre, that for a critical few seconds, many of the Soviet soldiers simply stared in disbelief. Then the Italian machine guns opened up. From the Soviet left flank, the heavy Schwarzlos and the faster-firing breeders began to chatter, their tracer rounds stitching lines of fire across the tops of the trenches. The fire was accurate and intense. Soviet machine gun crews on that flank, startled, immediately swiveled their weapons to engage this visible, conventional threat. Mortar teams began dropping rounds toward the muzzle flashes. The distraction was working perfectly. The attention of a third of the Soviet force was now fixed to their left. It was at that moment that the bugle sounded again. This was the call for the gallop. The long line of the second squadron surged forward. 600 hooves dug into the steppe, and the trot became a canter, then a full earth-shattering gallop. Colonel Bettoni rode at the front, his personal trumpeter beside him. Another signal, and from 1,000 scabbards came the shriek of steel. The sabers were drawn, the blades catching the first rays of the rising sun and reflecting them back as terrifying shards of light. The troopers let out a collective roar, a deep, primal cry that was not for propaganda or bravado, but a necessary release of the tension and fear that preceded the ultimate act of violence. It was the cry of the Savoia. The Soviet machine gunners in the center of the line recovered from their shock. They swung their weapons back to the front and opened fire. The rhythmic hammering of Degtyaryov and Maxim guns tore across the field. The air filled with the whip crack of supersonic bullets. Horses and men began to fall. A horse would scream and somersault, its rider thrown to the ground. A trooper would be plucked from his saddle as if by an invisible hand. The charge was now covering 1,000 meters of open ground, a distance that should have been a killing field, a mathematical certainty of annihilation. But the charge did not break. It did not falter. The gaps in the line were instantly filled as the troopers rode knee to knee. Their training took over. They were not individuals anymore. They were a single living weapon, a wave of flesh, horse, and steel, gaining momentum with every stride. They had absorbed the first volley, the most dangerous one. The Soviet gunners now had to contend with a target that was not just moving, but closing at a terrifying speed, 15 meters per second. The geometry of the engagement was changing with every heartbeat. A gunner would draw a bead on a horseman only to have him be 10 meters closer before the bullet could cross the distance. Panic, the cavalryman's greatest ally, began to infect the Soviet lines. The sight was simply impossible. It did not belong in their world of logic and mechanics. It was a nightmare from the pages of a history book come to life. As the charge closed to within 200 meters, the Italian troopers added a new sound to the symphony of battle. They began throwing their hand grenades. From the saddle, they pulled the pins with their teeth and hurled the bombs into the trenches ahead of them. The grenades, with their short fuses, exploded in blinding flashes of shrapnel and smoke directly inside the Soviet positions, stunning crews and disrupting the command structure. The wave of horsemen was now just meters away. Soviet riflemen who had been firing frantically now looked up from their sights to see the terrifying spectacle of a warhorse at full gallop, its eyes wide, its teeth bared, and on its back, a man with a raised saber, his face a mask of violent intent. The psychological impact was absolute. The ordered defense of the 304th Rifle Division shattered in an instant. It broke down into 3,000 individual struggles for survival. This was the moment of collision, the instant where the anachronism of the cavalry charge proved its brutal, timeless effectiveness. The first horses leaped the trenches, landing amidst the terrified defenders. The troopers were no longer just riders, they were destroyers. They spurred their mounts through the trench lines, their sabers rising and falling in deadly arcs. The heavy blades, backed by the momentum of a 1,000-pound horse, cleaved through rifles, helmets, and flesh with horrifying efficiency. There was no time to reload, no time to aim. It was a maelstrom of hacking steel, panicked shouting, and the screams of men and horses. The Soviets, so confident in their prepared positions, were now trapped in their own defenses, fighting an enemy that was above them, behind them, and all around them. Their rifles were too long to be effective in the close confines, their machine guns useless against an enemy that was already past their fields of fire. Simultaneously, the flanking attack hit. The 4th Squadron, having completed its wide maneuver undetected, crashed into the Soviet right flank. This was the final, decisive blow. The Soviet soldiers on that end of the line, already hearing the chaos from the frontal assault, were now themselves engulfed. Their command structure dissolved completely. Coordinated resistance ceased to exist. Pockets of soldiers fought back bravely, but many others, overwhelmed by the sheer shock and terror of the assault, threw down their weapons and tried to surrender or broke and ran for the rear for the safety of the Don River. The battle devolved into a series of frantic, desperate skirmishes amidst the trenches and foxholes. The initial charge was over, but the fighting continued, now on the cavalry's terms. The troopers of the 2nd Squadron were now fighting on foot, moving through the trenches with a terrifying efficiency. Having used the immense psychological and physical shock of the mounted charge to break the line, they now transitioned into a secondary role. Their sabers, once weapons of momentum, became deadly close-quarters blades. In the narrow confines of the trenches, a Soviet soldier trying to bring his long Mosin Nagant rifle to bear found himself facing an opponent with a meter of sharpened steel. The fighting was primitive, brutal, and swift. Other troopers, still mounted, galloped along the trench parapets, firing their carbines down into the stunned defenders and dropping grenades into machine gun nests that had survived the initial onslaught. The air was a cacophony of explosions, rifle shots, the clang of steel on steel, and the terrified screams of the wounded. The Soviet defense, so carefully planned, had been predicated on fighting a battle at 100 meters or more. They had no answer for a battle that was now taking place inside their own pockets at arm's length. Colonel Bettoni, observing from a slight rise, saw the chaos he had unleashed. The frontal assault had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. The Soviet center was a disorganized melee. The flank, hit by the 4th Squadron, was collapsing completely, with soldiers streaming back towards the river in a full rout. But the battle was not yet won. The Soviet position was deep, with secondary and tertiary lines of defense. Pockets of resistance were beginning to form as officers and commissars rallied men to make a stand. The momentum of the initial charge was waning as the attackers became bogged down in clearing the labyrinth of trenches. This was the critical moment, the point where a successful breakthrough could devolve into a costly stalemate. It was time for the final act. Bettoni turned to his trumpeter. The call echoed across the field once more, this time signaling the reserve. The 1st Squadron, held back until this precise moment, had watched the battle unfold. They were fresh, their horses calm, their riders filled with the potent combination of adrenaline and a clear view of the enemy's disintegration. Their charge would be different. They were not aiming for a prepared line of defense. They were aimed at the heart of the Soviet rear area. the command posts, the mortar pits that were still firing, and the supply caches. Their advance was a thunderclap across the already smoking battlefield. They galloped through the gaps created by the 2nd Squadron, leaping over the trenches where fighting was still raging, a fresh wave of destruction pouring into an already broken vessel. This second charge was the psychological breaking point for the remainder of the Soviet regiment. To the defenders who were attempting to rally, the sight of another full squadron of horsemen appearing from the smoke, sabers drawn, was an impossible vision. It suggested not a single, desperate attack, but a force of inexhaustible, terrifying power. It was a confirmation that their world had been turned upside down, that the rules of war as they understood them had been suspended. Resistance utterly collapsed. The pockets of fighting dissolved as soldiers abandoned their weapons. The rout became a flood, a panicked mass exodus towards the Don River. The men of the Savoia were now in full pursuit. The nature of the combat shifted from a frontal assault to an exploitation. Mounted troopers outpaced the fleeing infantry with ease, rounding up hundreds of prisoners. They captured the Soviet regimental command post intact, seizing documents and radios. They overran the mortar positions, capturing more than 10 heavy mortars and their stockpiles of ammunition. They seized dozens of machine guns, turning the weapons of the defense into trophies of their victory. The pursuit continued until the banks of the Don, where the fleeing remnants of the 304th Rifle Division scrambled to cross, many drowning in the attempt. In less than 2 hours, a battle that should have been a prolonged, grinding affair was over. A force of 600 cavalrymen had attacked and completely destroyed an entrenched infantry force of nearly 3,000. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the silence returned to the steppe. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of the aftermath, heavy with the smell of cordite, dust, and death. The battlefield was a surreal landscape. The bodies of over 150 Soviet soldiers lay in and around their trenches. Hundreds more were wounded. The greatest testament to the victory was the column of prisoners, nearly 600 men, marching into captivity, their faces etched with the shock of a defeat they still could not process. The Savoia had captured 4 field guns, 10 mortars, and over 50 machine guns. The Soviet bridgehead had not been contained. It had been annihilated. But the victory had a cost. 32 Italian troopers lay dead, among them the commander of the 2nd Squadron, Captain de Leon, killed at the head of the charge. Another 52 were wounded. More than 100 horses, the silent partners in the victory, were killed or had to be put down. The troopers walked the field, tending to their wounded comrades and their mounts, the exhilaration of the charge giving way to the grim reality of its price. They had performed a miracle of arms, a feat that would be studied by military historians for generations. They had proven that in the right circumstances, the oldest form of shock warfare was still devastatingly effective. Far from the battlefield, at the headquarters of the Soviet 21st Army, the reports that trickled in were met with disbelief, then fury. The initial dispatches were so outlandish they were dismissed as panicked fabrications. An entire regiment, gone, overrun by cavalry. It was impossible. The commanders demanded confirmation, believing it had to be a German panzer attack that had been misidentified. But subsequent reports from survivors confirmed the unbelievable truth. They spoke of a sea of horses, of flashing sabers, of a bugle call that heralded a vision from another age. For the Soviet command, this was a defeat that went beyond the loss of men and territory. It was an ideological failure. Their entire military doctrine was built on the supremacy of the machine, on the quantitative analysis of firepower. They had calculated the odds. They knew that a man with a machine gun in a trench could defeat 100 men on horses in the open. The mathematics were irrefutable, yet the mathematics had failed. They had failed to account for the variable of shock, the sheer psychological terror inspired by a perfectly timed charge. They had failed to understand that their own soldiers' belief in the machine made them uniquely vulnerable to something so completely outside their frame of reference. The Soviet soldiers were prepared to die in a hail of bullets from a German machine gun. They were not prepared to be cut down by a man on a horse wielding a saber. Their mistake was not in their assessment of cavalry as an obsolete technology, but in their assumption that the men who practiced it were also obsolete. They saw the horses and the sabers and saw weakness. They failed to see the centuries of tradition, discipline, and audacious spirit that they represented. The news of the charge at Izbushensky spread like wildfire. For the Italian army, often maligned by their German allies and struggling with poor equipment and morale on the Eastern Front, it was a moment of immense pride. It was a desperately needed victory, a demonstration of the martial valor, the virtù, that lay at the heart of the Italian military tradition. Colonel Bettoni and his regiment became national heroes. The regimental standard was awarded the Gold Medal of Military Valor, Italy's highest military honor. It was a propaganda coup, a story of Italian bravery that could be told without exaggeration or invention. The Germans, masters of mechanized warfare, were stunned. While they often looked down on their Italian allies' military prowess, they could not deny the result. A vital threat on their southern flank had been eliminated in a single, brilliant stroke, not by panzers, but by an action straight out of the Napoleonic Wars. The charge was a stunning tactical success, but it was also a swan song. It was one of the last glorious moments for horse cavalry in modern warfare. Even as the Savoia celebrated its victory, the larger realities of the Eastern Front were closing in. The war of machines would continue its inexorable grind. A few months later, during the Battle of Stalingrad, the entire Italian Eighth Army would be shattered by a massive Soviet offensive, Operation Uranus, which used hundreds of tanks and thousands of guns to encircle the German Sixth Army. In that maelstrom of industrial warfare, the Savoia, along with other cavalry units, would perform heroically once more, not in a charge, but in a desperate fighting retreat, screening the collapsing front and saving thousands of Italian and German soldiers from encirclement. But the charge at Izbushensky remained unique, a fleeting moment where the old ways proved not just relevant, but decisively superior. It was a victory of spirit over substance, of audacity over arithmetic. The Soviet commanders had looked at the Savoia cavalry and seen a relic. They saw an opponent that could be easily defeated by applying the standard formulas of modern war. That was their great mistake. They failed to understand that a weapon is only as obsolete as the enemy's ability to counter it. Against an enemy utterly unprepared for it, the cavalry charge proved to be the most modern, most effective, and most terrifying weapon on the field that day. The story of the charge is not just a story of Italian courage. It is a lesson in the psychology of warfare. It demonstrates that the most powerful weapon is not always the one with the greatest firepower, but the one that the enemy is least prepared, mentally and physically, to face. The Soviet soldiers at Izbushensky were not cowards. They were seasoned troops. But they were defeated before the first saber fell, because their minds could not process the reality of what was charging toward them out of the rising sun. They had prepared for a battle of machines and attrition, and what they got was a collision with a force that seemed to break the laws of their universe. The bugle call, the thundering hooves, the sun flashing on drawn steel. These were not just elements of an attack, they were weapons of psychological demolition. They were the tools that turned a confident, prepared defense into a rout. The final stark mathematics of the battle told a story that defied all conventional military logic. On one side, nearly 3,000 men in fortified positions, destroyed. On the other, 600 horsemen, victorious. The Soviets had thought the Italian cavalry was finished, a quaint and harmless anachronism. It was a mistake they would not forget, a lesson written in blood and steel on the grasslands of the Don. The legacy of the charge is a testament to the idea that victory can be found in the most unexpected places. In a war that was the ultimate expression of industrial might, a conflict that saw the development of atomic weapons and jet aircraft. One of its most brilliant tactical victories was achieved with weapons and methods that would have been familiar to the armies of the 19th century. It serves as a permanent reminder that the human element, courage, leadership, and the willingness to embrace audacious risks can never be fully discounted in the calculus of war. Colonel Bettoni's decision to charge was not a reckless gamble. It was a calculated risk based on a deep understanding of his own force's unique strengths and his enemy's psychological vulnerabilities. He chose a path that defied logic because he knew his enemy was a slave to that same logic. The men who followed him into the rising sun that day did not just defeat a Soviet regiment. They secured a place in history, a final glorious chapter for the age of the horse and saber, proving that even in the face of overwhelming modernity, the spirit of the cavalry was not yet finished. To fully comprehend the magnitude of what occurred on that August morning, one must place it within the context of the industrial behemoth that was the Second World War. By 1942, the conflict had become a brutal exercise in production calculus. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic early losses, had relocated its industries beyond the Ural Mountains and was churning out T-34 tanks and Ilyushin-II ground attack aircraft with a speed that stunned German planners. Soviet factories produced over 15 million Mosin-Nagant rifles in the course of the war, and their artillery parks were capable of firing tens of thousands of shells in a single day. This was a war of assembly lines, of steel output, of resource allocation. Victory, according to the prevailing doctrine of all major powers, would be awarded to the side that could produce and deploy the most machines of war. In this environment, the Savoia Cavalleria was more than an anachronism. It was a statistical impossibility. The primary weapon that won the Battle of Izbushensky was the model 1871 cavalry saber. It was a simple, brutally effective piece of forged steel, requiring skilled artisans to produce one at a time. The Soviet Union, in the time it took to forge 100 of these sabers, could produce a T-34 tank from raw materials. The horses themselves were the product of careful breeding and years of specialized training, a biological asset that could not be accelerated or mass-produced. When a horse was killed, it represented the loss of a multi-year investment, irreplaceable on the battlefield. When a Soviet tank was destroyed, a replacement was already rolling off an assembly line 1,000 miles to the east, manned by a crew that had received standardized, accelerated training. The charge at Izbushensky was therefore not just a victory against the odds, it was a victory against the very logic of the war. It was a fleeting moment where the artisanal, handcrafted violence of a prior age proved superior to the mass-produced industrial warfare of the present. This was achieved because the Italian command understood that the soldier in the trench, for all his modern equipment, was still a human being, susceptible to fear, shock, and disbelief. The Savoia did not defeat the Soviet rifles and machine guns, they defeated the men operating them. They used the enemy's modern mindset, their reliance on predictable mechanical threats as a weapon against them. The weapon at the center of this psychological demolition, the saber, was a marvel of ergonomic lethality. The heavy, slightly curved blade was designed not for fencing or intricate swordplay, but for delivering a single, devastating slash from a height and at speed. A trooper rising in the stirrups at the moment of impact could bring the full force of his own weight, combined with the momentum of his 1,000-pound horse, into a single cutting edge. The physics were terrifying. It was a human-guided missile, delivering an impact that could shatter bone and sever limbs. In the open field against a line of riflemen, it was a weapon of terror. The Soviet soldiers had been trained to fear the whine of a Stuka's siren and the rumble of a panzer's tracks. They had not been trained to process the high-pitched whistle of a saber slicing through the air an instant before impact. The impact of the victory was felt far beyond the immediate tactical situation. On a strategic level, the destruction of the Soviet bridgehead at Izbushensky secured the left flank of the Italian XX army corps for a critical period. This stabilization, bought with the blood of 32 cavalrymen, allowed the wider Axis front to remain coherent as the push towards Stalingrad reached its climax. It prevented a potential crisis, forcing Soviet planners to reconsider their assessments of the Italian sector and delaying subsequent offensive plans. It was a small victory in the grand scale of the Eastern Front, but it was a vital one, buying time that was measured in weeks. At its core, the success of the Savoia was rooted in a culture that could not be replicated on an assembly line. The troopers were part of a lineage stretching back to the 17th century. They were bound by a unique code of discipline and an almost fanatical regimental pride. Their relationship with their horses was not that of a mechanic to a machine, but of a hunter to his hound, a symbiotic partnership built on years of trust. This human factor was the invisible variable that the Soviet calculations had missed. They had quantified the Italians' firepower and found it wanting. They had not and could not quantify their spirit. Colonel Bettoni himself was the embodiment of this spirit. An Olympic-level equestrian, his understanding of a horse's capabilities, its speed, its endurance, its psychological limits, was absolute. His decision to charge was not born of desperation, but of a profound, intuitive knowledge of his unique weapon. He knew exactly how much shock a massed cavalry formation could generate. He knew his men and their mounts were capable of executing the maneuver flawlessly. He looked at the vast open steppe not as a deadly killing field, but as a perfect arena for the cavalry, a landscape that played to their greatest strength: speed. In the weeks that followed, the legend of the charge at Izbushensky grew with each telling. It became a story told around campfires by German and Italian soldiers alike, a much-needed injection of morale into a grueling campaign. It was a reminder that victory was not always decided by the number of tanks or the thickness of armor. It was proof that audacity could be a weapon in itself, that a single, perfectly executed act of courage could change the course of a battle. But the story of the Savoia is also a story of an ending. While they had proven the timeless effectiveness of the cavalry charge under ideal conditions, those conditions were rapidly vanishing from the face of the earth. The proliferation of automatic weapons, the ubiquity of armored vehicles, and the total dominance of the air by the end of the war would make such an action truly impossible. Izbushensky was not a new beginning for the cavalry. It was its last, brilliant, defiant roar. The ultimate irony is that the charge represented a victory of a pre-industrial mindset in the heart of the most industrialized war in history. The Savoia won because they did something their enemy could no longer imagine. The Soviets, and indeed all modern armies, had trained their soldiers to think in terms of fire and maneuver, of suppressive fire and flanking movements, all dictated by the capabilities of machines. Their tactical playbook had no chapter for dealing with a wave of 600 horsemen whose only goal was to collide with them at maximum speed. This gap in the modern military imagination was the breach that the Savoia cavalry galloped through. Their final legacy is a complex one. They stand as a testament to unparalleled bravery and the enduring power of tradition. But they also serve as a stark reminder of the brutal transition of warfare. The world that produced the men of the Savoia, a world of horsemanship, of dueling codes, of a personal connection to combat, was being irrevocably erased by the anonymous, long-range industrial slaughter of the Second World War. The charge at Izbushensky did not change the outcome of the war. The tide on the Eastern Front was turning, and the industrial might of the Soviet Union, combined with that of the Western Allies, would eventually crush the Axis. But for one brief, glorious moment on a sun-drenched morning, the men of the Savoia Cavalleria reminded the world that the formulas of war are not absolute. They proved that the courage of a few hundred men, channeled through a bold and unexpected plan, could shatter the strength of thousands. They rode out of the mists of history, delivered a single decisive blow, and rode back into legend. The Soviets had looked at their traditions, at their horses and their gleaming sabers, and concluded that they were finished. That conclusion, born of a rigid mechanical view of warfare, was their undoing. They had prepared for every conceivable modern threat, never realizing that the greatest danger they faced was a tactic they believed had died a century before. It was a fatal miscalculation, a lesson in humility delivered at the point of a saber,